So today's reading is taken from Luke 9, starting at verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. Whilst he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. This is the word of the Lord.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ruth, for bringing that reading to us. For those that don't know me, my name is David. I'm part of the staff team here at HTL. And this morning, we're going to be looking at the next session of our series, going slowly through the Gospel of Luke. This is a summer series that we're working through the summer holidays. Last week, Neil in the morning and Katie in the evening did a brilliant job of unpacking Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" And this week, we hear God's answer to that question. But before we jump into the passage, I'm going to start by telling you a completely true story of something that happened to me about 9 years ago in 2016. So at the time, I was having some kind of medical issues, and I needed to go for a medical procedure, an examination. And without going into too much detail, I'll use the biblical language, in a part of my body that we treat with greater honor. I'll just put it that way for those that know what that means. And so I went to the hospital. And I went in and I got ready. And the way they did it was they gave me some clothes to put on. So there was this kind of hat thing that they put to keep up my hair. And then there was like a hospital gown. And so the nurse came in, gave me the clothes, said, "You put the clothes on and then lie down on this bed." And she went out while I did it. So I put the hat on, I put the gown on, and I lay down on the bed awaiting my procedure. And the nurse then came in a little bit later on. And she said some words that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The nurse came into the room, looked at me and said, "Why are you wearing the pants on your head?" I promise you that really happened. So I know, like Peter, who I love in the Bible, that it's possible to completely misread a situation. That's it. That's the only link. We'll get to Peter later. So let's jump into our passage. This same story appears in 3 of the Gospels. It appears in Matthew 17, it appears in Mark 9, and then it appears in our passage tonight, which is in Luke 9. And this happens just a few days after the events we've looked at last week. Luke says 8 days, Mark says 6 days, probably somewhere in that vicinity. And Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, 3 of the 12 disciples who've been with him since right at the beginning of his ministry, up a mountain to pray. And as Jesus prays, his appearance is completely changed, and he becomes as bright as lightning itself, as it said in our passage. And then Jesus begins speaking to 2 men. These 2 men are Moses and Elijah, and they are titans of the Old Testament, and they both appear in glorious splendor next to him. So before we look at what's happening in this passage, I just want to zoom back a little bit. We're going to do a little bit of a look specifically at Moses and look at some of what has happened in Moses' life that's got him up to this point. And in the main, there's two things that I need you to know about Moses. The first thing is that Moses has a history with glory. He has a history with the glory of the Lord. Moses asked one of the most audacious requests in the Bible, or I think in all of history. In Exodus 33, verse 18, Exodus 33, 18, Moses spoke to God and he said, "Now show me your glory. Now show me your glory." And this is a man who arguably had the greatest experiences of the presence of God of anyone in the Old Testament up to that point. This is the man who had seen the burning bush and heard the audible voice of God. He'd seen the plagues of Egypt. He'd seen the parting of the Red Sea. Moses had many times spoken to God face to face. He'd heard the voice of God as he received the whole of the law and a large chunk of the Old Testament. And he'd stood in the cloud of the presence of God. And after going through all of that, on his fourth trip up a mountain that's recorded in Scripture, he turns to God and he says, "Now show me your glory." This mountain was a place where he'd always encountered God in incredible ways. But Moses realized that despite all of his experiences, there was a measure of God that he hadn't yet seen. He realized that to some extent, God had held back, that there's something that Moses hadn't encountered. And it's really interesting because he says, "Now show me your glory." And God's response to that question is, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. And so it gets set up that God just shows him his back. He walks past Moses and he just shows him his back. But he says, "You can't see my face." And that's in Exodus. All this happens in Exodus 33. But just 7 verses earlier than that question, in verse 11, we're told the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. So Moses has been speaking to the Lord face to face. He says, "Now show me your glory." And then God says, "You can't see my face." And there's something about when glory is added to the mix that changes the game. As soon as glory was added to the mix, even despite everything Moses had already experienced, suddenly the face of God was too much for him to see and to experience. So all he was able to see was the back of the Lord. The second thing that you need to know about Moses is something that happened right towards the end of Moses' life. And this is covered in Numbers 20 and Deuteronomy 32, for those that are taking notes. And Moses is told that he won't enter the promised land because of one moment of disobedience to God that had happened earlier in his life. In this moment, the people that Moses was leading, the people of God, the Israelites, they were thirsty and they asked Moses for help. And God told Moses, "Take your staff, stand in front of this particular rock and speak to it and command it to bring water." So Moses took his staff, he stood in front of the particular rock, and he hit it twice with the staff. Moses' entire life had been about reaching the promised land, and this literal tiny one moment of disobedience stopped him from entering. Now, I don't know about you, that seems super harsh to me. Like, it just feels like such a small thing, especially as earlier in Moses' life, in Exodus 17, they'd had the same situation. The people were thirsty, and God had said, "Take your staff and strike the rock." And that's what he was supposed to do. So he was just doing what he'd seen God ask him to do before. But that tiny little moment of disobedience stopped him from ever entering the promised land. The whole purpose of Moses' life, getting people to the promised land. And I think this is actually a picture of how sin separates us from God. It doesn't matter how small or insignificant the thing is that causes us to miss that mark. What matters is that we miss the mark. You either miss the mark or you don't, and that's how sin works. And that's what happened to Moses. That's what happened under the old covenant, that despite all of everything that had gone on, all of those experiences, that one moment of disobedience, and he's told, "No, that's it. You can't enter the promised land." So there's two things about Moses. One, he has a history with glory, and he'd asked God, "Now show me your glory." And he'd seen it in part, but he hadn't been able to see it face to face. And then he was told he would never enter the promised land. And the reason I'm doing some of that backstory is that there is a crazy redemption to Moses' story right here in this passage that I just want to draw out. Now, the mountain that's in the passage, we're not told exactly which mountain it is. Church tradition says that this happened on Mount Tabor, but most modern scholars today believe that this happened on Mount Hermon. Regardless of whether it's Mount Tabor or Mount Hermon, the amazing thing is that both of those mountains are in the Promised Land. So right in the middle of this passage, we see Moses standing in the Promised Land where he was told he would never be able to go. But through Jesus, he's now able to stand. And there's this crazy redemption of actually he was able to make it. He was able to make it. And what's more, God answered the most audacious request in history. God truly fulfilled, now show me your glory. Moses got to see the glory of God face to face. So let's dig into this idea of glory. It's a bit of a strange word. It's one of those words that we use a lot in the church. It's used a little bit in the world as well. And actually, when you look into it, it's quite hard to define. There's not like a really specific answer of what do we actually mean by glory. The word glory is the Greek word doxa, which literally comes from a root word meaning to have a thought. So it kind of means to be well thought of, at least in its roots. But really in the way it's used, it carries this sense of splendor, of magnificence, of divinity. C.S. Lewis does an amazing essay called The Weight of Glory. And he kind of settles on two concepts as he's trying to talk about glory. And one of them is this idea of weightiness, like a weighty heaviness of what it means to have glory. And the other one, he uses the word luminosity. I think that's a bit much for us in the morning on a Sunday, so we're going to go with shininess. So this sense of light exuding, of shininess, of luminosity coming into glory. But really, to understand what glory means, we kind of need to look at the context of how it's used, because it comes up all through Scripture. And as we see how it's used and how God speaks about glory, it helps us to understand it. And there are two kind of, I talked about Moses having a history with glory. There are two key kind of pictures of glory from the life of Moses, from the people in the wilderness, that are both echoed in this passage. So the first one is on the shininess front, that when Moses was in the presence of God, when he came out of it, his face would shine. And they would actually have to put a veil over him. At first to protect people from how shiny his face was. And then Hebrews talks later on about he would do it because actually the problem was that shininess would fade over time. That as Moses spent time out of the presence of God, that glory would reduce on his face, and he kept the veil over it so that the people wouldn't see that happening. The second thing we see happening in the story of Moses is this idea of the cloud of God's presence. That there will be a cloud of the presence that comes and is kind of, a glory cloud that represents and shows the presence of God. And that for me has that weightiness to it, that there's this thick weight in the atmosphere of glory. And we see that in the passage as well. But you see, Moses' glory is reflected. It fades over time. In this passage, the disciples are stood in this cloud of glory, but that glory is inherited. The cloud overshadows them, but it doesn't come from them. It's something that they step into. But Jesus' glory is totally different. It says in our passage that the appearance of his face changed. I love the account in Matthew 17 of this story. Matthew 17 says that Jesus' face shone like the sun. His face shone like the sun. And I think this is the perfect picture to understand what's going on here. The difference between Jesus and Moses and the disciples here is like the difference between the sun and the moon. When you look at the sun, what do you see? You see sunlight. When you look at the moon, what do you see? Now, we want to say moonlight, but when you actually think about it, what you're seeing when you look at the moon is still sunlight. Both the moon and the sun show sunlight. The moon is glorious to look at, but it is completely dependent on the sun. In reality, the moon is just a big gray rock. We've all seen pictures of the lunar landing, but the sun is so bright that we see it lit up and beautiful, even providing enough light for us to work here on a clear night. Moses' glory is the moon. The disciples' glory is the moon. Your glory is the moon, but Jesus is the sun. Jesus is the source of glory. He says in the Gospels, I am the light of the world. There's that luminosity, that shininess. And we were created to be the image of God. We were created to be the moon, to reflect his glory to the world. But the measure of glory that we get to walk in is entirely dependent on the extent to which we allow the sun to shine on us. The weight of glory that we walk in is entirely dependent on the extent to which we allow the sun to shine on us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, it says, "And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." And this is why worship is so important. As we gaze at him, we are literally transformed into his likeness. If you want to represent him out there, learn to worship him in here. Learn to worship him in the secret place. Get up that mountain and gaze. So this brings us back to Peter. What did he get so wrong in this passage? Let's read it again. This is Luke chapter 9, verse 33. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. So the Greek word that is translated here as shelter is the same one that is used in the Greek version of the Old Testament for tabernacle. Now, a tabernacle in the Old Testament was the tent that was put up by the people of God in the wilderness to house the presence of God. Once Israel had a permanent home in the Promised Land, it was replaced by the temple, which had essentially the same function, but was a permanent version of it. So in essence, the tabernacle was the dwelling place of God on earth. And so Peter suggests, let's build a tabernacle. He has this experience of the glory of God and says, let's build a tabernacle. And this is where I have a lot of sympathy for Peter. I mean, just a few verses earlier in the passage that we looked at last week, Peter had the revelation that Jesus is the Christ of God. It was a major turning point in his life. It was only 8 days ago. And now he's putting that newfound faith into practice. He's identifying that Jesus as God. And he's doing what any good Jew who knows their scriptures would do in that context, wanting to build a tabernacle. But the gospel writers are completely dismissive of Peter's suggestion. Luke here adds kind of almost in brackets, like, he did not know what he was saying. Like, isn't it obvious how terrible an idea this is? So what's so wrong with Peter's idea? I want to suggest that there's 2 main problems here. The first problem is the idea that the presence of God living in Jesus requires a tent, requires a shelter. Now, in the wilderness, when Moses was in the tent of meeting with God, a cloud would descend, but the purpose of that cloud is that it would come down at the entrance. It would guard the entrance. That tabernacle represented a divide between God and his people. God was inside the tabernacle and couldn't get out. The people were outside and couldn't get in. Since the Garden of Eden, God had not been able to dwell with his people. But Jesus changes all of that. God himself had put on a tent made not of canvas, but of human flesh, bone, and skin. For the first time since Eden, God was walking again among his people. And this is why Moses was able to see the glory of God face to face, when that was never possible before under the old covenant. Jesus brings an encounter with God that was never before possible. And after Peter makes this suggestion, God steps in. It says, while he was still speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. This time, when the cloud appears, it doesn't block an entrance. Instead, it covers the disciples, and it brings them into the presence. It actually allows them to draw closer to Jesus. God himself provides a tabernacle, a shelter, a covering for his people. The problem with Peter's idea of building a physical tent is that it would have kept Jesus up the mountain. And that's not what happens. That's not what Jesus does. In fact, there's this beautiful moment where the very next thing that Jesus does is he gets right back into the trenches, healing a boy with an unclean spirit, which we're going to hear about next week. He goes straight from this moment of absolute divine glory into a moment of extreme battle. And this brings us to the second problem with Peter's suggestion. He didn't just want to build one tabernacle. Oh no, he wanted to build three. One for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, Moses and Elijah held a real special significance for the Jews, and they're often used to represent the entire identity of the people of God. Moses represents the law, the commandments of God that were given to Israel to govern who they were, how they should live, and what it means to be God's set-apart people. The law represents the fundamental identity of the people of God as revealed in Israel. Elijah represents the prophets, the freshly spoken word of God to Israel, primarily to reveal God's heart for them and what he thinks about what has happened, what's currently happening, and what's going to happen. The prophets represent God's active involvement in the life of the people of Israel. So we have the law and the prophets. And when Peter says, let's build three tabernacles, he's putting the law of God and the prophecies of God on the same level as God himself. And more worryingly, he's suggesting building a house that is designed to host the presence of God himself and then to put mere men inside it. Moses and Elijah should never have a tabernacle. Even though we read that they appear in glorious splendor, even though they are carrying glory, they're the moon, not the sun. God again steps in here with one of the clearest demonstrations of the divinity and the supremacy of Jesus in the Gospels. Not only does the cloud of the presence descend, but God answers that question that Jesus asked in the passage that Neil and Katie looked at last week. But who do you say that I am? God says, this is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. God demonstrates the absolute supremacy of Jesus. This is my son. Listen to him. Not Moses, not Elijah, to him. The word for chosen here is singular in the Greek. The ESV translates it as, this is my son, my chosen one. Jesus is the only chosen one. And once the dust settles and God said this, there's no one left. No Moses, no Elijah, just Jesus. You want to know who God is? Look at Jesus. You want to know who you are? Look at Jesus. You want to follow God? Listen to Jesus. Bill Johnson puts it like this: Jesus Christ is perfect theology. Anything I believe about God that I don't see present in the person of Jesus Christ, I have reason to doubt. Jesus Christ is perfect theology. Anything I believe about God that I don't see present in the person of Jesus, I have reason to doubt. So as we start to come into close, there's one more thing I want to pull out of this passage. And names are really important in the Bible. And there's something going on here that I think is really interesting in terms of the names of the people that obviously lived at multiple thousands of years apart from each other. But there's something about God's kind of tapestry that he pulls this together. So if we jump to that next slide, please, Nathan. So we have Moses here. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to read with the dark writing. Can anyone tell me who Moses passed the torch on to? So when Moses finished in leadership, he passed it on to someone. Someone shouted out? Joshua. Look at that, very slick. Excellent. So Moses passed on to Joshua. Now, slightly harder question. Does anyone know what the name Joshua means in Hebrew? Yeah, it means God saves. God saves. Okay, the other person in the story we have, next slide, is Elijah. Does anyone know who Elijah passed the torch on to? Elisha, excellent. There we go. Now, this is the hardest question. Does anyone know what the word Elisha means? Even Jit is looking down. He's writing notes. The name Elisha means God saves. It's the exact same meaning. Now, in this passage, we have Moses and Elijah, and we see them passing the torch. It's very much kind of what's going on in the passage. They're there, they're speaking to Jesus. God says, this is my chosen one, and they disappear. And so we have Jesus come up. You guys know it's Jesus. We've already read that. Does anyone know what the name Jesus means? God saves. It's actually the same as the word Joshua in the Hebrew. It's just a different way of saying it. So we have this amazing moment where Moses passes on to Joshua, God saves. Elijah passes on to Elisha, God saves. But then both of those are pointing forwards to the one who will truly save us, to Jesus who saves. And it's interesting that it's actually the detail that Luke gives us that no one else does, is Luke tells us just a little bit about what they're speaking about. So when Jesus speaks to Moses and Elijah, it says that they speak of his departure, his upcoming departure. And that word departure, that's translated as departure for us, is another really interesting word. That is the word in the Greek, exodus. It's literally the word exodus, which is the primary story of God saving his people, again, that Moses had walked through. Everything in the law and the prophets points to Jesus. And they point to him first and foremost in his identity as Savior. Glory isn't just a concept. Glory has a name. And its name is Jesus. Its name is God saves. So if you're here this morning and you've never given your life to Jesus, and you're recognizing this morning that he is who he says he is, and that he is who God says that he is, then the good news for you is that he's not just glorious, but he is also your Savior. And today could be the first day of the rest of your life. So just as we land, I want to say, so what? Where does this leave us right now in August 2025 in HTL Church? And I think it's quite simple. We need a revelation of the glory of God. Like Moses, we need to learn to ask, now show me your glory. Even if we've seen stuff before, even if we've had experiences of God, to not just settle and say, well, that was probably what's been assigned to me. There's probably no more. But to learn to climb up that mountain again and say, now show me your glory. Like the disciples, we need to wake up from our sleep and see him for who he really is. It's a really interesting note in the story that the disciples are really sleepy when this all happens. And then it says, but when they woke up, they saw it. And I'm like, this is the craziest thing that's ever happened. How could you possibly miss that because you're feeling sleepy? But I mean, I relate to it now. I've got 2 small children. We need to wake up from our sleep and see him for who he really is. And there's 2 groups of people that I believe God is really wanting to minister to specifically this morning. The first is those who need to stop doing things in our own strength. We're wasting all of our energy trying to be the sun when all we're supposed to be is the moon. We've given up on the practice of gazing at Jesus and we're just trying to act like him. We're trying to pretend to be him. It's time to stop striving and to start gazing. And the other group is those who started building tabernacles for anything or anyone who isn't Jesus. It might be a person, might be a lifestyle choice, might even be another god or religion that we're trying to build a tent alongside Jesus. And it's time to hear the voice of the Father saying, this is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. Thank you.